Am I on? Yes. Hello, welcome. I haven't done anything for ages, so I thought I'd take this time now to do a live stream for you, just off the cuff. I got a couple of notes, stuff I want to talk about. There's been a lot that's happened since I last got on here and spoke to you all. The last thing I was talking about was probably the UK general election, 2019, so quite a few months back. So let's start off there, of all things. As you can see, I am stuck inside. I am self-isolating, as I'm sure a lot of you guys are. Apart from frontline staff, absolute props to nurses, doctors, key workers, carers, supermarket workers, people that really do matter in society, putting a lot of work in and essentially saving us from the failures of capitalism. But let's go from the beginning. So let's talk about the 2019 general election. It was a massive loss for the Labour Party, led by Jeremy Corbyn. Um, and this ties in with something that's happened really recently now, which was a lot of WhatsApp messages were put out, released by I think an unknown source, basically that were the inner conversations of some of the right wingers within the Labour Party, and it shows them actively undermining Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party, actively undermining the election campaign, both in 2017 and 2019, and really shows a sort of callousness that they have towards a movement that would bring change and popular policies to the forefront. Instead, they want to drag us all back to the quagmire of neoliberalism, which is sad but true, and their power and their vindictiveness knows no ends, essentially. But I think the 2019 election was lost by the Labour Party's policy on Brexit, essentially. In 2016, you had the referendum on membership of the European Union, and the Labour, and the leaving the European Union or Brexit was victorious in that. Since then, a lot of political parties have jumped to different extremes of the Leave Remain spectrum, as if the referendum was still being run. And sadly, a lot of the centrists and the liberals and the right wing of the Labour Party also wanted to ignore the results of the referendum and drag the party into a remaining position. Jeremy Corbyn, of course, being a lifelong Leave supporter, who was sort of dragged into a Remain position by his party's popular vote, by the consensus. In 2016, but he's still sceptical of the European Union, and I think the same sort of right wingers and centrists in the Labour Party used this really as another opportunity to try and oust Jeremy Corbyn and left-wing politics from the party. This came to a head in the Labour conference in 2019, last year, where they ended up with the most convoluted Brexit policy ever imaginable, really, because they were going to have a second referendum. So basically, they're calling people who voted the first time stupid. You voted wrong, try again. Very undemocratic, in my opinion. And they were going to negotiate a new deal. So it was a deal that hadn't been negotiated yet, and they were going to put Remain on the ballot. So it didn't communicate. And at this point, you've got to look at the demographic of the voters of the country. There's a lot of turn to sort of nationalism or isolationism, or essentially just a move away from larger, essentially neoliberal structures. So in Scotland, there was a very close vote earlier in the last decade with regards to whether Scotland wanted to remain part of the Union with England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, of which the remaining with the Union narrowly won, but the people who were energised over leaving it basically changed their vote to the Scottish National Party, who then wiped out Labour in Scotland and put in what is looking like a pretty permanent status quo of Scottish National Party. Same thing, I think, played out here with Brexit, where the country were, completely disillusioned with neoliberalism, with with sort of unaccountable structures, um, and really wanted to mess up the status quo, very much like in Scotland, which is not working for normal people, and thus there was a rebellion against the establishment position, which was to remain in the European Union, and that didn't go away. So when the Conservative Party here in the UK, who were very much divided over Brexit, there was half the party wanted to stay, half the party wanted to sort of capitalize on the energy of leaving. They sort of threw out the Remain side when Boris Johnson became the de facto leader last year, and essentially, in order to cling on to power, I guess the entire party just basically hid its Remain history and went full throttle into being a Brexit party, essentially becoming UKIP, really. And then the 2019 election essentially just became a second referendum on the European Union, with the Remain vote divided because the Labour Party position wasn't succinctly Remain. It was very much convoluted, as I said. So thus you had a huge wipeout for a lot of Labour seats, a lot of traditional Labour constituencies in the Midlands and the North, who may or may not have had any real allegiance to the Conservative Party or to Boris Johnson, but essentially voted for the Conservative Party because they wanted to see Brexit done. And had absolutely no interest whatsoever in a second referendum, with Remain being on the ballot. And also, there's the legacy of many years of Blairism and centrist right-wing Labour Party prior to the last 10 years of Conservative government that really hadn't been fixed or addressed at all by the Corbyn movement, which was still pretty in the national image, pretty London-centric and pretty sort of student-centric. So Labour lost. Labour had a fantastic manifesto, lots of socialist policies, lots of policies that were very popular that people really wanted: renationalising the railway, funding the NHS properly, proper living wage, all this sort of stuff that would really benefit us, especially right now, was fleshed out of the conversation in place of basically a Brexit referendum. I don't know if that was entirely on purpose or the aim of the Labour right wing and centrists that pushed for Labour to adopt that position, but they have shown in these recent WhatsApp group conversations that have been released that they were pretty happy to throw an election, hand it to the Conservatives in order to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn. So I don't know if they're that callous, but it looks very much like they were, and they may well have used the People's Vote campaign and what was left of the sort of Remain ticket to try and oust Jeremy Corbyn, as an end, means to an end to that. So that's what I think happened there. We've just come to the end of the Jeremy Corbyn chapter. He said that he would step down after the next leadership race. The leadership race for the Labour Party has concluded last week, with the shadow Brexit the shadow Brexit minister, Keir Starmer, the person who negotiated and championed this losing Brexit policy, won the leadership election and is now the leader of the Labour Party that he helped sink, essentially. So I can't see any real hope of electoral recovery for the Labour Party. I can't see any real hope for the left wing of the Labour Party to try and reclaim the party after the loss and after Jeremy Corbyn's tenureship has ended. So I think that's basically over for the Labour Party. So as many people are, I'd say a mass exodus, really. It's time for something new. and it's time for a new party, a new movement to step into the place of the previous Corbyn movement. And we need to not be so focused on winning elections or necessarily on fighting, for something that's in 4 years' time now, which is the next general election, and be more focused on change that we can actually make happen, that we have been making happen under 10 years of Conservative government, which is community action, trade unions, and organising in your workplace. I mean, you've had some historic moments in the last couple of years, such as McDonald's going on strike, Wetherspoons going on strike, pubs, restaurants, areas that are not traditionally unionised, areas of work that aren't traditionally unionised, getting involved with the union movement, and essentially younger people are also getting involved with that. And I recommend more of that. I think that's a real antidote to the death of Corbynism. And I think also that should have really been championed by Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell and his supporters in the Labour Party. Whilst they had a large platform, they should have definitely recommended more people get involved with the union movement. But sadly, that didn't happen. But these are the contradictions of the Labour Party, unfortunately. I'm going to change gears a bit now. I feel like I've just rattled on for 10 minutes about Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party and all this sort of stuff that's starting to feel like yesterday's news now. Just to say a couple of words about American politics. So there's Bernie Sanders, and I don't know if any of my followers or anyone that might be dipping in to watch this right now know as much or are involved with American politics as well. But there has just been a leadership race for the Democratic candidate for the election that's scheduled for later this year. We'll still see if that's going ahead with this crisis that we're going through at the moment. And whilst it started looking like the left-wing candidate, the American Corbyn, if you will, although quite a lot more charismatic, I'd say, and a lot better when put on the spot, Bernie Sanders looked like he had it in the bag at the start of this campaign, but as a lot of the other sort of centrist or Democratic candidates sort of stepped down and endorsed the former vice president of America under Obama, which is Joe Biden, the wheels started to come off a bit of the Sanders campaign. And then for some reason, really unceremoniously in the last week, despite still having a very small but potential chance of either winning or at least dragging some concessions from the only other remaining candidate, Joe Biden, with regards to Medicare for all, which is essentially free healthcare like we have here in this country, or what's left of what we have here in this country, which is Britain, if you've just joined us, and decent living wage and various sort of nationalised industries. Very similar sort of ticket, very popular policies. And for some reason, Bernie Sanders, who's always been great, always stuck to his guns, has just unceremoniously stepped down and not asked for any concessions for that privilege, and has actually today just endorsed Joe Biden, which is pretty sickening if you're on the left, especially I can imagine even more so if you're on the left in America. Because and if you've been fighting for that that Bernie Sanders campaign, and it's a bit of a shattering defeat, but also we can say from a socialist class perspective, generally that's predictable. The politics of electoral politics of the bourgeois are always going to fold in the face of centrism, essentially. And this is just what's happened now. It's pretty unfortunate. Joe Biden is a terrible candidate. He's not particularly sharp on camera, so going up against Donald Trump isn't going to be a pretty sight, really, for any of his supporters. He hasn't, as I said, no concession policies. Like, it's all just straight up, neoliberal continuation of the status quo. Maybe not as bad as Donald Trump, but still not particularly good, and not really a lot for working class people. So that's another bit of a tragedy, really. But again, if we look at it in the long run, completely predictable, and it's happened so many times in the past that I don't know why people I'm particularly surprised at this stage. It's our fault, and I was rooting for Jeremy Corbyn and for Bernie Sanders, and for me, I shouldn't have let myself get excited, but I did for a moment because it looked like there was going to be a a sort of victory for the left, within the confines of capitalist bourgeois democracy. But still, any win's better than no win at the moment. So I'm just having a sip of water because I'm nattering on. Got some people watching now. Hello there. How are you doing? Not loads of you, but I appreciate all the watchers I've got. So yeah, now I'm going to move on. So that's everything that's happened up until this point. Let's talk about this point. We are in a crisis. We're in a pandemic. This is COVID-19 sweeping across the globe, and essentially spreading very rapidly in the air to a lot of people. And we are now all in quarantine. We're all stuck at home, or out at work, risking our lives to try and keep people eating, keep people in hospitals, keep people alive. So hats off, take my hat off to key workers out there. You really are saving the day. And what's interesting about this is capitalism is not prepared for this crisis. It was not ready in the slightest. It could have been stockpiling the resources needed to deal with a global pandemic, but it didn't, because it was cheaper not to. But the contradiction of that is now the capitalist world has lost more money than it would have cost to stockpile those resources in dealing with this pandemic. So we live in such a short-sighted economic system of immediate what's the word, instant gratification from a monetary perspective, from the perspective of bosses and politicians that support that system, that people would rather gamble and lose in a big way than make concessions and make preparations for a worst case scenario. And we are in a worst case scenario. But what can we take away from this crisis so far? That a lot of the jobs that everyone does aren't necessary, apart from supermarket workers, nurses, doctors, people who pick up your rubbish, garbage if you're watching from America, people who are carers, people that look after people, that deal with feeding people, that deal with water, that deal with waste removal. That seems to be it, really. And what are all these other jobs, and why are A, we completely able to work from home if you are working from home, or B, just not work at all and everything seems to be running absolutely fine? I think this is a real expose of the capitalist system that we lived in before we were in quarantine, and now essentially to a certain extent we're living in socialism. Obviously we're not, because a lot of people are receiving pay from work. They're on a waiting list to receive benefits from the government to top up the fact that they've either been fired or that they're on a 0-hour contract and aren't being paid because obviously they're not at work. So it's still a pretty harsh system, and obviously lots of people are dying. But we are kind of living in a sort of socialist situation at the moment, in the way that only the jobs that need to be done are being done, and all of the bullshit that seems to be cut out, and it appears like it wasn't really necessary for the running of our society in the first place anyway. So as Adam Curtis said, in better words than I'm about to, most jobs are bullshit. But what can we learn from this? Put some comments down below about that one. I'm still concocting theories in my head about what this will mean, and what the world will look like after this crisis is over. Just going to move on now. So the current Prime Minister of this country, Boris Johnson, so he's just come out of hospital. He came down with the COVID-19 virus and was on ventilators and was out of action. This is obviously a sign that the rich and the wealthy and the powerful are also not safe from this virus. You know, your money can't save you from airborne germs, apparently. But also interesting being as Boris Johnson and Donald Trump seem to be pretty much on top of the world as far as the worst leaders uh, who've dealt with this crisis, because Britain and America are pretty much some of the worst hit countries and also the worst prepared and have the worst reaction. The way Boris Johnson has treated this has been completely abysmal. From start, he said herd mentality. He said we need the virus to move through the population, and some people will die, which I think is horrific. He's just sentenced a large amount of the population to death so that capitalism can continue and profit can continue to be accumulated at the expense of lives of innocent people, of workers like you and I, whilst instead he could have been taking the precautions that all of the other countries that have successfully dealt with the crisis, such as Vietnam and Cuba and South Korea, who are getting it very much under control now, who've got much lower death rates than us. Rather than learning from those mistakes, we're learning from those processes that had happened on a timeline before it happened here. So we had enough time to prepare for this crisis coming here, decided to ignore it and go for this herd immunity, which is absolutely disgusting. And now more people are dying than need to, really. I mean, we had like almost 1,000 deaths in one day the other day in this country, in the sixth richest country in the world, a country that could have had access to all of the necessary medical equipment, the tests, and the precautions, such as the social isolation that we're doing at the moment. If we did all this at such an earlier stage, we would be in a much better position now, and we would be looking at the end of this. So, as it stands right now, we don't know when this will end. We don't know when isolation will end. And Boris Johnson has not only failed as a prime minister, he has failed to look after the health and the safety of the people of this country. He has failed to deal with a global pandemic in a way that had already been shown to him that would be successful to deal with it. He's completely failed to take any advice from any experts or any field studies, and completely gone against that, and again cost lives. But not only that, he's failed his own system and he's failed his own class. He's failed capitalism because he hasn't reacted to this virus in the same way that other countries have. He's now cost businesses in this country, millions and billions of pounds, and threw a lot of companies under the bus. Essentially, I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing, but what I'm saying is, as a conservative, pro-capitalist prime minister and a neoliberal one at that, you'd think it'd at least have the back of the private interests that pay his way, that support his party, that his party is in the interest of, which is not you and I, which is not working people, which is not nurses, doctors, food workers, teachers. His party is entirely in the interest of the rich and the wealthy and the powerful, and he's failed them too. He's failed us. That's fair. We expected him to fail us because he's not there for us. He's failed his own class. He's utter blunder to the world. And I think, I'll leave you on that note, really. I've been rattling on now for 20 minutes. This is longer than most of my normal videos. How are you all doing? That's what I want to know. Let me know down below. And also, obviously I've got a bit more time now stuck inside. If you want me to do a proper video on anything else, if you've got any subjects, yeah, whack them in the comment section as well. Is this the end of capitalism? That's the real question. Capitalism certainly is looking pretty sick in face of this sickness. But I think only time will tell. But in the meantime, if you are still in work, make sure you join a union, okay? Because at the moment we have no representation in Parliament. We've no representation of any parties, both in Britain or America. So we have to do that ourselves. So get involved with your local community groups, get involved with a union in your workplace, and make sure your colleagues and your neighbours are also getting involved with that sort of stuff, because the powers above will not look after us, and they never will. But we can look after each other. Speaking of which, look after each other, look after yourselves, stay safe, and I'll speak to you next time. This is the James Show. Out. Cheers.